My ex-husband Bradley slapped the thick manila envelope onto the reception desk. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, ensuring my nursing colleagues were paying attention. "Full custody," he announced. His voice carried the exact right amount of manufactured grief. "You kept my son away from me for 6 years. Megan. That ends today." He expected a public breakdown. I didn't blink. I pulled out the petition, checked the last page, and slid it right back across the laminate counter. "You filed this in the wrong county," I said. "And this is a hospital, not your stage." He thought a fresh legal threat would erase history. He forgot that I kept the receipts. I traced the sharp loop of his signature on the petition. It hadn't changed. 6 years ago, his handwriting looked exactly the same under the harsh lights of the NICU. Monitors were blaring red. I was recovering from an emergency delivery, watching our premature son fight for breath inside an incubator. Bradley never looked at the baby. He threw a medical proxy and financial severance form onto my bed, legally abandoning us to dodge the crippling medical bills. "You're a sinking ship, and I'm not drowning with you," he said. Then he walked out and drove straight to the airport with my sister Haley. The following 6 years were defined by the weight of that single signature. When Bradley boarded a flight to Paris with my own flesh and blood, my life became a spreadsheet of survival. I was a neonatal nurse. I spent my days keeping other people's fragile infants alive, then spent my nights doing the exact same thing for my own. The financial severance Bradley engineered left me with over $400,000 in medical debt. The collection agencies called every morning at 8. I learned to negotiate payment plans while feeding Leo through a tiny gastric tube. Every overtime shift, every double weekend, every holiday I worked was a quiet payment against the price of my son's survival. I didn't have the luxury of an emotional collapse. I simply put on my scrubs and went back to work. Haley blocked my number the day they landed in Europe. My family told me to be the bigger person and let them go. As if watching your sister build a life with your husband was just a minor misunderstanding. I stopped answering their calls. I paid the debt. I watched Leo grow from a fragile 2-pound preemie into a thriving little boy. I built a fortress around us, brick by brick. And I made sure the foundation was completely mine. Now, the architect of that disaster was standing in my lobby, pretending the wreckage never happened. Bradley checked his gold watch, annoyed that his grand entrance hadn't shattered my composure. He leaned closer to the counter, dropping his voice so the approaching security guard wouldn't hear. "You can't hide him forever," Bradley warned. "I have the money. I have the lawyers. I'm going to be a father to my boy." A man who abandons a dying infant doesn't spend 6 years in silence only to suddenly discover his paternal instincts on a random Tuesday. There was always an angle. Something had shifted in his perfectly curated world, and he suddenly needed a child to fix it. I just needed to figure out what he was actually trying to buy. I folded the petition into perfect thirds. I slid it into my leather tote bag and snapped the clasp shut. Bradley watched my hands, waiting for them to shake. They didn't. I looked past him to the front doors of the hospital. "Dave." I called out to the daytime security guard. "This gentleman is finished at the desk. Please walk him out." Bradley's jaw tightened. He leaned in, tapping the visitor badge on his lapel. "You work Tuesday through Saturday. Megan. First shift. I know exactly where to find you now." He turned and let Dave escort him through the sliding glass doors. He had my schedule. That was the price of keeping the lobby quiet. I parked in my driveway 40 minutes later. The smell of melted butter and vanilla hit me before I even took off my coat. My husband Luke was standing at the stove in his gray sweatpants, holding a spatula like a tennis racket. Our 6-year-old son Leo stood on a yellow plastic step stool beside him, covered in flour. "Flip it on 3, Luke said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. 1, 2, 3. Leo tossed the pancake into the air. It landed half in the pan and half on the burner. They both laughed. Luke didn't yell about the mess. He just grabbed a damp towel and wiped down the stove while Leo cheered. I stood in the doorway, watching the two of them. This was what a father looked like. I walked to the kitchen island and set my tote bag on the granite counter. The folded petition was heavy inside it. 6 years ago, I didn't just inherit $400,000 in medical debt. I paid for Leo's life with my own blood. My placenta had abrupted. I was bleeding out on the operating table, and the surgical team was shouting for a crash cart. Bradley was the chief of surgery. He knew exactly what those monitors meant. He stood at the door, tossed the financial severance on my bed, and walked out to meet my sister Haley in the parking lot. I flatlined twice that night. I fought my way back to the living just to make sure my son had someone. I pulled out my phone and dialed Melissa. She worked in hospital administration and knew every piece of leverage moving through the boardroom. I didn't say hello. I just asked why Bradley was suddenly in my lobby. He is up for chief medical officer. Melissa said over the line. The board votes in 3 weeks. But it is not just about the title. It is about his new mother-in-law. Eleanor. I said, exactly. Eleanor just pledged $50 million for the new pediatric wing. She is old money, traditional, and obsessed with family values. Bradley sold her a tragic story. He told her his bitter ex-wife ran off with his only son and changed her number. He needs to produce the boy to prove he is the devoted family man he claims to be. If he doesn't, Eleanor pulls her endorsement, and the board gives the job to someone else. I ended the call and looked at my kitchen. Leo was eating his crooked pancake, kicking his feet under the stool. Luke caught my eye and poured me a mug of black coffee. Exactly how I took it. He didn't ask questions. He just made room for me. Bradley wanted to use my son as a prop to buy a promotion. He chose the wrong mother. Melissa walked into the neonatal break room at 10 in the morning on Thursday. She bypassed the coffee machine entirely and set a 2-inch stack of legal documents on the table in front of me. It is a court-ordered subpoena, Melissa said. Her voice was strictly professional, but her eyes were tight. Bradley's lawyers filed an emergency motion. They are demanding 7 years of your tax returns, credit reports, and a psychiatric evaluation. They are claiming your history of massive medical debt makes you financially unstable. They are forcing the hospital administration to audit your employment records. He was not just trying to take my son, he was using the legal system to threaten my career. I could not simply wave him away anymore. The court order was a hard wall. If I failed to provide a bulletproof counterfile proving my financial competence within 14 days, a judge would grant Bradley temporary custody pending a full investigation. I finished my shift. I went home and carried 3 gray plastic storage bins down from the attic. My husband Luke and I sat on the living room rug after Leo went to sleep. The only sound in the house was the quiet hum of the refrigerator. We sorted through 6 years of survival. Bank statements, tax returns, and payment schedules were piled around us in neat stacks. Luke had already categorized the medical bills by year. He never complained about the late hours or the mess. He just opened another box and kept sorting. Here is the final clearance letter from the Medical Collection Agency, Luke said. He handed me a watermarked page. This proves you paid off the entire $400,000 3 years ago. I placed it in the safe pile. I need the starting baseline. The court wants a comprehensive timeline. I need to show them exactly what assets I had right before the debt hit. I pulled a heavy manila lever from the bottom of the last bin. It was the estate file from my grandmother. She had passed away 2 months before Leo was born. I opened the bound ledger to find the original account statements. I flipped past the legal jargon and stopped at the final disbursement page. I did not find my name. I found a zero balance. My grandmother's trust contained a very specific generation clause. The money was designed to be split equally between my sister Haley and me. However, if either of us had a living child at the time of distribution, a third independent share would automatically be carved out and locked into an educational trust for that great-grandchild. I looked at the execution date on the bank transfer. October 12th. It was the exact morning after my emergency delivery. I turned the page. Attached to the bank transfer was a copy of the medical proxy and financial severance. Haley had submitted it to the estate executor alongside a forged notification that my premature son had not survived the night. She used Bradley's signature as chief of surgery to legitimize the lie, triggering the sole surviving heir rapid disbursement clause before the hospital could even log Leo's birth certificate. The bank released the entire estate directly into Haley's private account at 9 in the morning. She and Bradley boarded a flight to Paris less than 3 hours later. For 6 years, my parents begged me to forgive her. They said Haley cried on the phone every holiday, claiming she just followed her heart and made a passionate mistake. She played the tragic, romantic victim perfectly. But this ledger had no emotions. It just had timestamps. Haley did not just steal a husband. She meticulously timed the collapse of my marriage to steal the only financial safety net my son had before he could even take his first breath. I stared at the bank stamp. I had my counterfile. Luke traded a weekend shift at the firehouse to attend Leo's 6-year wellness check on Tuesday morning. We sat in the pediatric exam room on the 3rd floor of the East Wing for nearly an hour. Luke asked the pediatrician specific questions about Leo's seasonal asthma triggers and checked the latest growth percentile charts. He knew exactly which medication worked best before bedtime and exactly how to distract Leo during a vaccination. He did not have to study a medical file to act like a parent. He had simply been there for every fever and every scraped knee. We walked out of the clinic and headed toward the glass elevators in the VIP atrium. The morning sun reflected off the polished marble floors. That was when I saw the camera lens pointing directly at us. Bradley stood near the reception desk. He wore a navy blue tailored suit, looking every bit the pristine candidate for chief medical officer. A young woman with a professional camera stood 2 steps behind him. Wearing a lanyard from the hospital's internal communications department, I understood the stage immediately. Bradley's new billionaire mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance, sat on the hospital's board of directors. She built her family empire on strict traditional values and expected her executives to reflect a flawless domestic image before she wrote any checks. Bradley needed a candid photograph for the quarterly newsletter to prove his messy first marriage was actually a story of a devoted father fighting to reclaim his lost child. He needed to secure Eleanor's endorsement before the final board vote next month. And my son was the perfect prop. Bradley stepped directly into our path. He ignored Luke completely and crouched down to Leo's eye level. He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket. "Hi, Leo," Bradley said. His voice was projected loudly enough for the photographer to hear every syllable. "I am your father. I brought you something very special today." He opened the envelope and pulled out a certificate with a heavy gold foil seal. "It is a $50,000 educational trust. For your future." He expected Leo to step forward. He thought a 6-year-old boy would understand the concept of financial leverage. He genuinely believed an expensive piece of paper could instantly bridge a lifetime of absence and erase the thousands of nights he had spent entirely somewhere else. Attempting to buy a child's trust with a high-priced gift only proved how much of a stranger he actually was. Leo looked at the gold seal. Then he looked up at Bradley's face. There was no recognition, no hesitation, and no curiosity. Leo took 2 quick steps backward and wrapped his arms firmly around Luke's right leg. He buried his face against Luke's denim jeans. "Dad," Leo whispered. "Can we go to the car now?" The silence in the atrium was absolute. The photographer slowly lowered her camera. Realizing she had just framed a disaster instead of a heartwarming reunion, Luke did not puff out his chest. He did not raise his voice or tell Bradley to step back. Luke simply placed his large hand on the back of Leo's head, shielding him from the camera. "We are going right now, buddy," Luke said quietly. Bradley remained kneeling on the floor. His perfectly practiced smile fractured. The muscles in his jaw tightened until the skin turned white. A man with a towering ego does not feel pain when he loses a family connection. He only shatters when he sees the position he believes is rightfully his being effortlessly occupied by someone else. He was not looking at his son. He was glaring directly at Luke. I stepped between Bradley and my family. I did not raise my voice. "You cannot buy 6 years with a piece of paper." Bradley. Tell your photographer to delete whatever she just took. Bradley stood up. The generous, devoted father vanished entirely. He slipped the certificate back into his jacket pocket and took half a step toward me. The legal route is taking too long, Bradley said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I have a mediation hearing scheduled for Thursday morning. You are going to sit at that table, and you are going to agree to joint custody on paper. The mediator will look at my salary, my new marriage, and my status in this hospital. If you embarrass me again, Megan, I will make sure the board audits every single dollar of your medical debt and spins it as financial incompetence. He turned and walked toward the administrative wing without looking back at Leo. I had protected my son from the camera, but I knew exactly what that small victory cost me. Bradley was done playing the tragic victim in public. He was preparing to rewrite history on the official legal record. The mediation office smelled like lemon polish and stale coffee. We sat around a heavy mahogany table on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. Bradley wore a soft gray sweater instead of his usual tailored suit. He looked approachable. He looked like a man who had made a simple mistake and was desperate to make things right. I was in shock, Bradley told the mediator. He kept his voice low, injecting just the right amount of regret into his tone. Our son was born 16 weeks early. It was a terrifying night. I signed what I thought was a temporary medical proxy so Megan could make immediate decisions while I went to clear my head. When I came back a few days later, she had changed her phone number. She completely isolated herself. The mediator, a woman in her late 50s named Mrs. Higgins, gave him a soft, understanding nod. She folded her hands on the table and turned her attention to me. The look she gave me was heavy, with the specific, judgmental pity reserved for bitter single mothers. Courts generally favor reconciliation. Megan. Mrs. Higgins said gently. A child needs his father, withholding him out of spite, especially when Bradley is offering full financial support, does not look good on an evaluation. I sat perfectly still. The legal system was practically designed to reward men who wore nice sweaters and spoke in calm, reasonable voices. The external block was solid. The mediator was entirely on his side. Seeing me as nothing more than an angry woman holding a grudge, Bradley sensed he was winning. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. Megan has always been too emotional to look at the facts, Bradley said, offering Mrs. Higgins a sad smile. She creates these narratives where everyone is against her. She uses our son to punish me for a failed marriage. I just want to be a father. I looked at his hands. 6 years ago, when I found a hotel receipt in his coat pocket and asked him about my sister. He used those exact words. He told me I was too emotional to see things clearly. He used my reaction to his betrayal as proof that I was the problem. It was a brilliant strategy to silence someone who noticed too much. Back then, it made me question my sanity. Today, it just sounded like a tired script. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my mental state. I simply unzipped my tote bag. I did not change my phone number. I said, and you did not go away to clear your head. I pulled out 3 sheets of standard copy paper. There were no forensic seals or complicated technical diagrams. It was just a basic printout from the hospital's internal directory. I had asked a receptionist in the administrative wing to print Bradley's old inbox rules before they archived his previous department files. I slid the papers across the polished wood. I did not hand them to Bradley. I pushed them directly in front of Mrs. Higgins. That is a printout of the email filters on his chief of surgery account. I said, look at the timestamp at the top of the first page. He set those rules the morning after Leo was born. Mrs. Higgins put on her reading glasses. She traced her finger down the printed list. Any internal hospital email containing the word NICU, Leo, or Code Blue, was automatically routed directly to the trash folder. I said, he did not lose contact. He clicked a button to ensure he would never have to see a notification when his son stopped breathing. The warm, sympathetic expression vanished from the mediator's face. She read the rule a second time. Then she looked at the second page, which showed exactly how many critical alerts from the neonatal intensive care unit had bypassed his inbox and gone straight into the digital garbage. There were 74 of them. Bradley's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Bradley stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. "You did not walk away because you were in shock," I said. "You built a digital wall to make sure you could ignore him while he was dying." Mrs. Higgins took off her glasses. She did not look at Bradley with pity anymore. She looked at him like he was something she had scraped off her shoe. The mediation ended 5 minutes later. Bradley stormed out of the room. He thought he could lie his way through the legal system. Now he had a mediator's report that would document his exact level of cruelty. But I knew this was only a temporary setback. A man who wanted to be chief medical officer would not stop at a failed mediation. Melissa walked into the break room on Thursday afternoon and handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. It bore the embossed gold seal of the hospital board of directors. "This was delivered by courier," Melissa said. "Straight from the executive suite." I broke the wax seal. Inside was a formal summons. The board was convening a closed-door ethics and pressure evaluation hearing for the chief medical officer shortlist on Monday morning. They requested my presence as a frontline witness. I had seen Eleanor Vance exactly twice in my 14-year career. Both times were during the annual pediatric fundraising galas. She was a woman who wore tailored wool suits and expected absolute perfection. She did not just sit on the board. She controlled the $50 million endowment keeping the new surgical wing afloat. She viewed the hospital's reputation as a direct reflection of her own family name. To her, a chief medical officer was not just an administrative role, it was a moral representative of her legacy. The board routinely pulled senior nursing staff with spotless disciplinary records to blind review executive candidates on their temperament. They wanted the perspective of the people who actually kept the hospital running. Eleanor did not know I was Bradley's ex-wife. She only knew I was the most tenured nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit. I folded the heavy paper and placed it in my locker. I had my golden ticket into the room. My shift ended at 11 o'clock that night. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. Snow blew sideways through the concrete grates of the employee parking garage, dusting the asphalt in a thin layer of white. My boots crunched loudly in the quiet structure. Bradley was leaning against the driver's side door of my 10-year-old sedan. He wore a heavy cashmere coat, but his shoulders were hunched against the freezing wind. The polished, confident veneer he wore at the mediation table had cracked. The internal server logs had backed him into a corner. And desperation makes arrogant men sloppy. I stopped 3 feet away from the car. I did not ask him to move. I waited. "Let's skip the lawyers," Bradley said. His breath plumed in the frigid air. "The mediator is going to drag this out for months. Neither of us wants that." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a rectangular slip of paper. It was not a legal motion. It was a personal check. He slapped it face up on the frosty roof of my car. $100,000. Bradley said. "You cash it tomorrow morning. We sign a joint custody agreement on paper. You keep Leo at your house. I take him 1 weekend a month. Just enough for the cameras. You drop the hostility. And you get to be debt-free." I looked at the zeros written in dark blue ink. 6 years ago, that amount of money would have saved me from bankruptcy. It would have bought groceries, asthma medication, and a few hours of sleep. Now, it was just a piece of paper getting wet in the snow. "You don't want a son," I said. "You want a prop." "I want the chief medical officer position," Bradley snapped. The friendly negotiation mask slipped completely. "Eleanor is breathing down my neck about family values. If I don't secure this custody arrangement," she pulls her endorsement, "you are standing in the way of my entire career." "I am standing next to my car," I said. "You are the one standing in the cold." I picked up the check by the corner. I did not tear it up. I walked over to his spotless black Mercedes parked across the aisle. I lifted the windshield wiper, pinned the check securely beneath the thick rubber blade, and let it snap back against the glass. "Leo is not for sale," I said. I walked back to my car, got in, and locked the doors. Bradley stood perfectly still in the snow, watching my headlights wash over him as I pulled out of the space. I had secured my place in the boardroom. I had the invitation sitting in my passenger seat, but by refusing his money, I had forced his hand. A narcissist stripped of his easiest solution does not simply surrender. He calculates the next strike. He knew he could not buy my silence. He had to destroy me now. Monday morning brought a blinding winter sun that reflected off the glass windows of the executive boardroom on the 10th floor. 12 board members sat around a massive mahogany table. Eleanor Vance occupied the head seat. She wore a charcoal gray suit with a simple pearl necklace, her posture perfectly straight. She did not look at me when I entered and took my assigned seat at the far end of the room. She was not there to make friends. She was there to protect her $50 million investment and ensure her incoming chief medical officer possessed a flawless moral compass. The heavy double doors opened at precisely 9 o'clock. Bradley walked in. He did not look like the man who had stood shivering in the snow 3 nights ago. He wore a crisp navy suit and carried himself with the practiced authority of a man who owned the building. 2 lawyers flanked him. They carried briefcases thick with paperwork. This was an internal ethics and pressure evaluation hearing. But Bradley did not wait for the board chairman to ask the first question. He took control of the room before he even sat down. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bradley began. His voice echoed smoothly off the wood-paneled walls. "I know we are here to discuss my qualifications for chief medical officer, but a situation has escalated over the weekend that directly threatens the reputation of this hospital. I cannot in good conscience accept this promotion without addressing a severe liability currently operating inside your neonatal intensive care unit." One of his lawyers unzipped a leather briefcase. He began passing thick black binders with clear plastic covers down the length of the table. Every board member received a copy. Eleanor Vance adjusted her reading glasses and opened the first page. "6 years ago, my ex-wife Megan pushed me away during a time of immense grief," Bradley said. He adopted a tone of heavy, reluctant sorrow. "I gave her space. I provided financial support. I trusted her to raise our premature son. That was the greatest mistake of my life. I kept my hands folded on the table and listened to him rewrite history." He pointed to the open binders. "You will see the medical records my legal team subpoenaed last week," Bradley continued. "Megan works in your NICU. She is surrounded by vulnerable infants. And she has brought that pathology home. She has kept my son in a state of artificial medical dependency. She exaggerates his seasonal asthma. She schedules unnecessary pediatric visits to keep him isolated. It is a textbook case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And she is using her employment at this hospital to facilitate it." A heavy silence fell over the boardroom. Several executives shifted in their leather chairs, exchanging uneasy glances. Accusing a tenured neonatal nurse of medical child abuse was a nuclear strike. Bradley turned to page 4 of his fabricated dossier. "She works 70 hours a week, claiming she needs to pay off medical debt. But as you can see on the next page, I offered her a $100,000 settlement just last week to ensure my son's comfort. She rejected it. She prefers the martyrdom of a struggling single mother over the actual well-being of her child." He leaned forward and placed both hands on the table. He looked directly at Eleanor now, playing the role of the protective, desperate patriarch perfectly. "If the press discovers that this hospital employs a nurse actively harming her own child, the public relations fallout will be catastrophic," Bradley warned softly. "Lawsuits will follow. Donors will pull their funding. The liability is astronomical." He let the threat hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds before offering his solution. "I am filing an emergency injunction today to take full, immediate custody of my son," Bradley said. "I will get Megan the psychiatric help she clearly needs. I will handle this quietly. entirely within the family. But I need the board's cooperation. I need her suspended pending a full psychological evaluation. If we handle this internally, the hospital avoids a scandal. And I can finally bring my son home. The trap was brilliant. He took the subpoenaed medical records and twisted my 6 years of vigilant survival into a psychiatric disorder. He weaponized the hospital's fear of a PR disaster to force them to fire me. Once I was unemployed and under investigation, a family court judge would hand him custody in a matter of days. He would secure his pristine family image, lock in Eleanor's endorsement, and destroy me in a single motion. He looked across the long table at me. His eyes were cold and triumphant. He expected me to stand up. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to call him a liar. A hysterical outburst would perfectly validate his accusation that I was mentally unstable. I did not raise my voice. I did not move my hands. I watched him the way you watch a cornered animal burning its last reserve of energy. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. He looked at me with clear discomfort. The weight of a $50 million donor sitting heavily on his shoulders. "Megan," the chairman said quietly, "these are severe allegations. Do you have a response?" I reached for my bag. The chairman of the board gestured toward the wooden podium at the front of the room. 12 pairs of eyes followed me as I stood up from my chair. They expected a frantic woman. They expected a mother backed into a corner, ready to cry and scream about her innocence. Bradley had just handed them a 60-page binder diagnosing me with a psychiatric disorder. He had set the stage for a hysterical breakdown. I did not give him one. I walked to the podium. My footsteps were quiet on the thick carpet. I did not carry a leather briefcase. I only carried a single, thin manila folder. I set it on the wood. "You have a very thick binder in front of you," I said. My voice was steady. I kept my pitch completely flat, using the exact cadence I used when handing over a critical patient chart at the end of a 12-hour shift. "It contains theories, character assessments, and media projections." I brought 2 pieces of paper. Bradley leaned back in his chair. He crossed his arms, maintaining his mask of sorrowful concern. His lawyers watched me like hawks, waiting for a legal misstep. I looked directly at Eleanor Vance. She sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly over Bradley's fabricated dossier. "Bradley claims I isolated myself," I said. "He claims he was forced out of his son's life and simply wanted to respect my space during a crisis." I opened my folder. I pulled out the standard copy paper I had secured from the administrative wing. I walked around the podium and slid it down the center of the table. It came to a stop inches from Eleanor's hands. "That is a printout of the internal hospital server logs," I said. "It shows the exact email filters configured on Bradley's chief of surgery account 6 years ago. The morning after our son was born, he manually set a rule to route every message containing my name or the neonatal intensive care unit directly into the trash." A low murmur rippled down the sides of the table. 2 board members leaned closer to look at the copy. Bradley's arms uncrossed. He shifted his weight, his leather chair squeaking loudly in the quiet room. "That is an administrative error," Bradley said. His voice was a fraction too loud. "IT resets those filters during department transitions. This is exactly the kind of paranoid delusion I was talking about. She is fundamentally unstable." He was falling back on his favorite tactic. When a liar's fabricated history is challenged by hard evidence, their only defense is aggressive invalidation. He needed the board to view me as crazy so they would ignore the timestamp on the paper. I ignored his outburst completely. I reached into my folder for the final document. The heavy, textured paper felt solid between my fingers. The red notary stamp in the bottom corner caught the overhead light. "An email filter can be blamed on a system error," I said. "A notarized signature cannot." I walked directly to the head of the table. I placed the original medical proxy and financial severance squarely on top of Bradley's thick PR dossier, right under Eleanor's chin. Bradley did not step away to clear his head. I said. He did not suffer from a lack of communication. He stood next to my bed while our son was fighting for his life on a ventilator. He brought a notary into the recovery room. He signed this document to legally sever all parental rights and all medical proxy obligations. Bradley dropped the sorrowful father act. The mask shattered instantly. He slammed his open hand flat against the mahogany table. The loud crack made the board secretary jump in her seat. "This is a private family matter," Bradley yelled. He stood up too fast. The heavy leather chair rolled backward and hit the credenza behind him. He reached across the table, his fingers stretching desperately to snatch the paper away from his mother-in-law. "This has absolutely nothing to do with my professional capacity or this hospital." Eleanor did not flinch. She did not look at him. She simply lifted her left hand and swatted his arm away with a sharp, dismissive strike. It was a cold, effortless motion. The way you brush away an annoying insect. Bradley froze, his hand hanging empty over the polished wood. I looked at the 12 board members. The truth was finally sitting in the open. "It has everything to do with this hospital," I said quietly. "Because he surrendered those rights to dodge $400,000 in premature neonatal billing. He sold his son's life to protect his own personal bank account. He is sitting here today asking for control of your pediatric surgical wing, using the exact same child as a character reference to secure his promotion." Nobody spoke. The silence in the room was absolute. The fabricated narrative of the loving, alienated father burned to the ground in less than 3 minutes. Bradley stood awkwardly over the table, breathing heavily, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The executives who had nodded sympathetically at him just moments ago were now staring at him with open disgust. The lawyers who had confidently passed out his binders were suddenly very interested in their own legal pads. The power no longer belonged to Bradley. The illusion of control he had spent 6 years building evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. The decision was no longer a matter of corporate policy or public relations. It belonged entirely to the woman sitting at the head of the table. Eleanor put on her glasses. Eleanor Vance did not rush. She picked up the original medical proxy and financial severance with steady hands. She adjusted her reading glasses and read the document from the top left corner to the bottom right signature line. The 12 executives in the boardroom sat in complete silence. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning vent above the massive mahogany table. Bradley stood frozen near the podium. The aggressive, commanding energy he had carried into the room evaporated entirely. He watched his mother-in-law read the exact legal instrument he had used to discard his premature son. Eleanor turned the page. She looked at the red notary stamp. She looked at the date. She traced the ink of his signature. Then she took her glasses off and placed them carefully next to her leather portfolio. She did not look at me. She looked directly at Bradley. "You married my daughter 14 months ago," Eleanor said. Her voice was not loud. It was the quiet, absolute tone of a woman who dismantled rival corporations for a living. "You sat at my dining table in Aspen and told me a tragic story. You said you were a devoted father who was cruelly alienated from his only child. You said your ex-wife was emotionally unstable, that she changed her number and vanished." Bradley opened his mouth. No sound came out. He raised his right hand halfway, a weak gesture of defense, then let it drop back to his side. "This document is dated 6 years ago," Eleanor continued. She tapped the heavy paper with one manicured finger. "It was executed the morning after the boy was born. You legally surrendered your parental rights and severed your financial obligations to avoid paying medical bills for an infant in intensive care." "Eleanor, please," Bradley finally stammered. His voice was thin and reedy, stripped of all its usual resonance. The context of that night was complicated. The hospital administration was pressuring me. Megan wasn't thinking clearly. "Do not insult my intelligence," Eleanor said. She stood up, smoothing the front of her charcoal jacket. "You abandoned a dying child to protect your stock portfolio. Then you used that same child as a public relations tool to secure my endorsement. She turned her attention to the chairman of the board. He sat rigidly in his high-backed leather chair, his hands flat on the table. My family foundation pledged $50 million to fund the new pediatric surgical wing, Eleanor said. That pledge was explicitly contingent on this hospital maintaining the highest ethical standards in its leadership. If Bradley remains on the shortlist for chief medical officer, or if he retains his position as chief of surgery past 5 o'clock today, I will withdraw the entire $50 million. I will also publicly state exactly why the foundation pulled its support. The chairman swallowed hard. He looked at the other executives. Nobody shook their head. Nobody offered a single word of defense. The chairman nodded once, effortlessly abandoning Bradley to save the hospital's funding. Bradley's face drained of color. The confident mask cracked. He suddenly realized the floor had vanished. He reached for the edge of the mahogany table to steady his trembling body. His hand was shaking so violently that he knocked over his own leather folio. His heavy gold fountain pen rolled off the polished wood. It hit the floor with a sharp, metallic clatter. It rolled across the carpet until it stopped right against the toe of my shoe. Bradley stared down at the pen. He did not bend over to pick it up. He just stared at the floor, his chest heaving, his brain entirely unable to process the total collapse of his carefully constructed kingdom. Eleanor picked up her portfolio. She looked down at him with pure disgust. "You will clear your belongings out of my daughter's house by tomorrow morning," Eleanor said to him. "My attorneys will serve you with divorce papers before noon. You are officially removed from the Vance Family Trust." She walked past him without waiting for a response. The two lawyers who had flanked Bradley earlier quietly gathered their briefcases and stepped away from him, creating a physical distance between themselves and a ruined man. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. "This ethics hearing is concluded. The candidate is disqualified." I looked down at the gold pen resting against my shoe. I did not kick it back to him. I picked up my folder, turned around, and walked out through the double doors. The room stayed dead silent. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I sat at my kitchen counter and forwarded my grandmother's trust fund ledger alongside the time-stamped medical proxy directly to the estate's law firm. The senior partner called me back within 20 minutes. By noon, the attorneys filed an emergency injunction with the county court. Haley's personal and business bank accounts were frozen, pending a massive criminal fraud investigation. She had used a forged declaration of medical abandonment to steal a dying infant's inheritance, using the money to fund her glamorous escape to Paris. Now, the legal system was aggressively clawing every single cent back. She was entirely broke, facing multiple felony charges for wire fraud. And Bradley was no longer around to pay her expensive legal retainers. I walked into my house at 5 o'clock that evening after a long shift at the hospital. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the hallway. In the kitchen, my husband Luke had Leo perched high on his shoulders. He pretended to drop him into the stainless steel sink while Leo shrieked with pure, unrestrained laughter. It was a picture of absolute safety. I stood in the doorway. I did not step onto the kitchen tile. I placed my hands on the edge of the granite island and pressed down until my knuckles turned completely white. My chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. I looked at my husband and my son, and my brain immediately began calculating exactly how much money I had hidden in my emergency savings account. I planned out exactly which apartment complex across town I could rent if Luke packed his bags and walked out tomorrow. I mapped out a brutal financial survival grid while my family laughed 10 feet away from me. You can pour all the billionaire trust funds in the world on a severed root, but a man who walks out of a NICU has already taught the tree how to survive the drought. I know exactly what you are screaming at your screen right now. You are asking why Megan didn't just walk into the hospital administration on day one and show them the medical proxy. Why did she endure the insulting mediation, the ambush in the VIP wing, and the agonizing wait for the ethics hearing? When you deal with toxic family members, your brain gets hijacked by something called the slot machine effect. Psychologists call it intermittent reinforcement. You get absolutely nothing for years, and then suddenly, A man like Bradley shows up with a $50,000 certificate, playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken father. It is a tiny crumb of hope. You pull the lever, hoping that this time, you will hit the jackpot of a normal, loving family. But the house always wins. They only feed you those crumbs to keep you sitting at the table while they empty your pockets. Megan knew the game was rigged. She didn't just walk away from the table. She burned the entire casino down. Let's look at how she actually did it. Because there is a masterclass in self-defense here. First, she used a move we can call the silent audit. During that mediation hearing, Bradley relied on his charm and his tailored sweater to sell a story about a devastated father who lost contact. Megan didn't argue with his emotions. She didn't raise her voice to prove she was a good mother. She brought the IT logs. Never argue with a narcissist's feelings. Argue with their timestamps. Then, she used the misdirection. At the ethics hearing, Bradley used a classic abuser tactic called Darvo deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. He tried to frame Megan as the abuser with a fabricated Munchausen by proxy diagnosis. She let him build his massive 60-page PR dossier. She let him pass the binders around the mahogany table. She let him overplay his hand and commit entirely to his lie. She waited until his illusion was perfectly constructed before she dropped the original notarized severance document on the wood. She didn't just prove him wrong. She let him prove himself a liar in front of the one billionaire sponsor he needed most. Your worth is not determined by the people who abandoned you when you were fighting for your life. If you have ever had to build a fortress out of your own survival, I want to hear from you. Leave your story in the comments below. And subscribe to join us for the next one.